So this is the start of the intermediate section. I'm expecting that you probably have gone to a few trainings, have familiarized yourself with the format, maybe have even done a couple tournaments, but are looking to see how you could possibly improve further. I'm gonna release the first half of this series, which will focus on prep time as well as how do you make a good argument. The latter half will talk more about extensions, rebuttal strategy, etc. But for now, we're just going to talk about prepping and making good arguments. So, as an overview, I think, or rather, I hope that this will serve as a guide as to what should be running in your mind during prep time. And while this should hopefully be helpful, I don't expect it to be something that will immediately click. I think prep time is very difficult because it's not a lot of time, and when you're starting out especially, it doesn't feel like you have much time at all to be able to prepare. So hopefully this helps speed up that process, but note that maybe having a list of questions would help, but it won't make things magically better. Hopefully a noticeable difference is possible. Second is there are many questions I'm going to put here as like guides. I don't think though they're going to be useful in all debates. Just things that you should be keeping in the back of your mind. So note that there's some questions here that some debates will be completely useless. It's a matter of identifying which questions are going to be helpful and what you can use. There's some that I think will be applicable for all debates, but some I've put in just in case they would be applicable for a particular debate. Last is I'll just run through a sample prep time strategy that I tend to use with a bit of difference. Important notes. The first is that your prep strategy can depend heavily on your partner. It's important to prep before tournaments or practice prep before tournaments so that you can find a good middle ground. Well, everyone preps differently, and what I'm going to be putting here might be very different from the way you prep. I don't think there's a right way to go about it. In fact, I think finding comfort in prep is one of the more important aspects of that prep time. That said, I think being exposed to different ideas during prep, or rather ways to prep, is very helpful. Second is, I think, beyond just like the actual debate stuff, you want to minimize all the variances in your prep time. And if you're online, that means make sure your platform is decided and you have like backup devices, backup internet connections when needed. Just because I think not only are you wasting time when this kind of stuff gets disrupted, but at the same time, you get kind of like uh, put out of focus. You might not be on your A game. And I think these little things matter given how much of a mental activity debate is. I don't think there's as much muscle memory as other sports, for example, where you could kind of rely on experience. I think sometimes you're like off your game and it'll really affect the round in the speech. Similar online, Similarly to online rather, on-site tournaments, you should be doing the same thing. Set up common prep areas, routes for buildings that you're going to go to, ways that you'll go about it, getting to know the campus or wherever you're debating first, if possible, I think is a huge help for making sure you're minimizing that prep variance. Last is I think when you're prepping, you want to number one, maximize activity, meaning don't be idle. 15 minutes is not a lot of time, but I think it becomes a lot of time if you're doing a lot of things. And so you want to make sure that there are no lull moments, or that if there are, you're minimizing them as much as possible. Second is you want to avoid redundancy. There are times when, especially in Asians, when there are three people, or 3v3 rather, when there are three people, um, it's really helpful to have everyone be doing different things. That said, you want to get everyone on the same page, which is the last bullet. But you want to make sure as well that you're not having everyone build the same argument and end up coming up with the same points of material. Sometimes you would want to delegate tasks, and sometimes you would want to work on things together. It's about identifying what those things might be. So, prep outline. I think a lot of people identify prep as let's try and make as many arguments as possible, where I feel like that's not the best way to prep. Moreover, I think even when people say it's not just about arguments, they focus on setup, context, etc. But I think a lot of it should really be about strategy and understanding the game of debating. So, one, you should want to craft a prep strategy based on your position and your partner. And these are things that I think can be done even before tournaments. So knowing exactly how you're going to do it. Second is you want to assess the scope of the debate. We'll go into more in-depth stuff on assessing the scope, creating your overall strategy and lines of attack, contextualizing the debate, and finally making arguments. I think making arguments you should do last, but at the same time, I still think it's the one you should spend the most amount of time on. Prep strategy, or things that you can do even before prep. So first you want to ask is what are our roles as partners? Because understanding your prep dynamic and knowing especially when to change this up, because maybe some people know more about a certain topic, a certain theme, etc. You might want to divide tasks. So maybe you'll assign someone to be more on the case construction side, while the other person will listen to the things that they think of and work more on organizing things to make them, be communicated in a very understandable manner. Things like note taking, I think, are very important, and it's very hard, I think, to think of the case, take note of it, and think of so many other things. So knowing who to delegate that to, or preemption. I think it's very helpful to have one person on your team at least to continuously think of what is the other side going to say and how are we going to counter that. Because I think if you wait for the debate for that to happen, you will end up in a lot of situations where you don't have enough time, where you're put in an uncomfortable spot, and you realize that just by thinking of ways to preempt, you're actively avoiding bad situations for you and your team in the debate. Next is you want to adjust based on your position. So, should you focus more on speech refinement and opening? And what I mean by that is, when you're in opening, you don't really have much time to polish and fix your speech. And so I would spend a bit more time doing that during prep time, as opposed to when I'm in closing. I would maybe focus on the refinement, the speech before mine, or a couple speeches before mine. But if you're speaking prime minister, you don't really have that kind of luxury because it's prep time and then it's immediately your speech. Similarly, in closing, maybe instead of trying to have the nicest speech possible, instead you come up with new arguments. Because sometimes you come up with a really nice speech, your opening takes it, and now you have to do everything again. But you didn't have new material that you had prepared already that you can pivot to during the round. You are still thinking of new arguments, and I think you would want to focus on that a bit more during prep. Silent time, I think, is something that could be very productive or unproductive depending on how you go about it. I like to have more silent time at closing. So I will rather not talk to my partner for a few minutes and just think. And that's just because sometimes having a silent time will help you refine your ideas a bit more in your head, explore certain angles you want to discuss. Because there will be ways in which your prep dynamic, one partner might maybe overpower the other in terms of ideas, or you might get distracted, might not be able to focus when someone else is talking. So silent time is something that I think could be possibly very important. Second is you want to assess the scope of the debate. And I like doing this before making arguments because you want to know what kinds of arguments can you really make. So you do this because it'll inform the way that you make arguments. So you want to ask questions like, is this a wide debate or a narrow debate? Meaning, is this a debate where you have so many different arguments to come up with, or a few arguments that you just have to argue very, very well? So for example, in this house prefers a world where people cannot lie, versus this house would ban non-disclosure agreements. I think this house prefers a world where people cannot lie is just much wider a debate, because beyond the legal system where the second debate will mostly exist, you're probably going to have a lot of other debates. So you can have a debate about interpersonal relationships, people and their friends and their family. You can have a political debate. You can have a debate about fake news in the media. And there's so many different angles to it. And understanding, where should my brain be going? Should I be zeroing in and working to characterize something as nice as possible? Or should I be trying to look at all the possible ways this debate could go and thinking, what's the best direction we should take? Second is you want to see if it's a high impact or a low impact debate. So you want to get this right, because if you have a high impact motion but you don't have high impact arguments, you will not really do well in the round because you seem like a very unimpactful team. Similarly, if you have a high impact argument in a low impact debate, people won't believe you, because if it's not proportionate to the impact that you have, then it might not be the best argument to make. So for example, this house supports federalism in countries with significant ethnic tension, versus this house believes that disadvantaged groups should seek to create new characters in media that represent them, rather than create new versions of established characters. I think the first debate is a lot more impactful than the second debate. And so if in the first debate you're going to explain, I don't know, very small impacts, you might not end up winning. While in the second debate, if you're explaining that these disadvantaged groups will no longer be discriminated entirely, that they'll get full social-political rights just because of some new characters in media, which to be fair, can be impactful, but definitely not as impactful as fundamental changes in legal systems, for example. it might be a bit more difficult to believe that all these things could happen. Last is you want to check, is this a classic debate? Is there an interesting twist? Because when you understand or see a debate motion for like the millionth time, you think, ah, there's a case here, and I know it. But there will be times when there are small changes in the words that could fundamentally change how the debate works. So in Worlds 2020, there was a motion that this House supports the rapid elimination of all tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. An important word here is rapid, because I think a lot of debate might be the conventional is free trade good, is free trade bad, versus if you factor in the rapid elimination, explaining why it has to happen now, why a slow process would not be good, what happens when a slow process occurs instead, I think would allow you to make very clever arguments that if your opening would take away extensions from your closing, and if your closing could potentially give you more room for extension. Next, you want to craft your overall strategy. So at this point, you probably have a general idea of what you want to argue. I don't think you should form the arguments fully just yet. Like, I think you want to think, here are 3 arguments we could make. Don't think here's argument 1, label analysis, impacts, weighing, and then argument 2, you can do that later. Things you might want to assess now are 1, what goals are our arguments trying to achieve, and then why are these goals important? Third is, will our opponents likely oppose these goals or try to achieve these themselves? Because that might affect your weighing and how you preempt. So for example, if they want to oppose these goals, maybe you could say, let's say a prime minister, you might want to say, this is the goal we're trying to achieve. It is the most important goal in the debate in comparison to anything else. Maybe bring up things up could say, etc. Or if you think they'll try to achieve these themselves, you might say, this is an important goal, and here is why this is the best method of being able to achieve this goal. So knowing your strategy would really help like your preemptions in terms of how you place yourself in the round. Lastly, at closing, you want to think, will your opening take these arguments? Because if so, then I don't think you should build them, or you should think here are the more clever parts of this argument that could be points of extension, rather than, going along the same lines of argumentation. Next is you want to contextualize the debate. So if you're just starting out, I think you might want to ignore the previous parts. Not to say ignore, but I think you might want to start out here because this is a more easier part to understand in terms of preparation. The previous parts were more strategic in nature. This one I think is more how are you going to approach the debate and the content you can come up with. With some guide questions for contextualizing the debate. One is, where does this debate apply? So are we talking about these types of countries, these groups of people, etc.? Second is, who is involved? So if it's an IR motion, what other countries could possibly be involved? I've noticed that in IR motions, even in countries, or rather, IR motions that don't involve Russia and China, a lot of teams end up using Russia and China as points of extension. So you want to think, could they get involved? Could they not get involved? Is it a likely thing to occur? And you might want to assess, should we integrate that in the case? Third, has there been recent news on the topic? Because your adjudication chorus will be scouring the news to make motions. And you'd want to think, here's what inspired the adj core for this motion, and here's why it's important. And I think recent news is important, not just because I feel like it could be the basis for a motion, but also because it's probably what everyone has in mind when you're discussing a motion. So sometimes you'll give an example, but people are like, I don't know this example, I don't know who this is or what this is. And definitely it should be up to debaters to explain these examples. But as a debater, it does help if people already have an idea. Next is, how does this change the status quo? Because you want to ask, how are the two sides different? Because oftentimes government is a change from the status quo and opposition is in defense of the status quo. You really want to explain what are the main differences between the two sides. Next, are alternatives insufficient or sufficient? Because if you're going to change the status quo, you want to explain, look, we could try these other solutions, they will also not work, or we have already tried them and they didn't work. Similarly, on op, you might want to say, here are other solutions you've tried, here's how they could be here's how they are working, or here's how they could possibly get better. Last is, what are the comparatives of this debate? So if you're going to set up a motion, you want to explain, here is where the two sides are probably going to exist. So let's say the motion is this house should ban guns. You don't just want to say why banning guns is good rather. You want to say, on our side we will ban guns. On opposition, they will probably try and regulate guns. And then explain why regulation is insufficient, what regulation might look like, etc., in order to ensure that you are being comparative at each step in the debate. Next is you want to craft arguments. So I think the video in the beginner series would be helpful here in just explaining what an argument requires. The next few videos will go into each one. So how do you analyze an argument, how do you impact an argument, and how do you weigh an argument will be the next 3 videos in order to ensure this crafting arguments process is as fine-tuned as possible. Last is you want to take some time to finish off prep. There will be times where you're interrupted before you're even done, but if you have any additional time, if you're walking into the room, these are the things you should be thinking. Number 1 is, are you all on the same page? Because there are cases that can be very good that become very, very bad if teammates disagree or don't think that the case should be what it is. Second is, are you missing any crucial parts of the case? Is it a policy motion and you didn't have a proposal? Is it a motion where you didn't set up any context at all? Is there an argument you feel like you should have run, etc.? Because if this is the case, if you can adjust immediately, go ahead. But if not, it's very important that later speakers like deputies, whips, etc. will know how to adjust in order to ensure that you can fill in the gaps. Third is, do you have a backup plan? Sometimes there will be scenarios in debate where you don't know what the scenario is going to be or the next scenario is going to be. So for example, if you have an extension that you think is really, really good and you think it'll win, but opening could potentially take it, you're not sure, but they might, you have to think, what is another extension we might have? And what is our strategy if that's the extension we have to take? Similarly, in a motion where you have a policy, you don't know what opposition could use as their counter policy. And so you might think, if this is the first policy they have, here's our response. If it's the second policy that they have, here's our response. So always come up with a backup plan when possible. Lastly, is there anything pending that we should think of during the round? So maybe there's something in prep you didn't finish. You want to ensure that during the round, you guys know that someone is working on it. So let's say there's an argument that they have that you know you would really, really have to respond to. You should make everyone informed that this is how you respond to it. Especially, I would say, first speakers. Because when first speakers are done speaking, they might not have much else to do. So they can help with rebuttals or things like that. So for example, if you think there should be a POI that you should raise during the round, you would want to maybe give that role to first speaker so that second and third speakers should finish off on their speech. So make sure everyone is involved in whatever might be pending still. That is all for the first part. So this one is now just a sample prep structure that could be helpful. So firstly, just understand the scope of the debate. I honestly don't think this takes much time because I think the answers might be immediately obvious. You might just want to get on the same page here. But second, so first is just wide, narrow, big impact or small impact, or is there any twist? So things you discussed earlier. Second is, again, earlier questions, just contextualizing the debate. Next is setup. These are a bit more specific than the context we had talked about earlier, but now it's more of what does your side stand for? Because a lot of the context we set up earlier was a bit neutral in nature, like where does this debate occur, who is involved, etc. This one is now more for your side. So what is going to be your policy, for example? What does your side stand for? What do you envision? What are the differences of your side and their side? And you might want to give just a short, maybe 10-second, here are the 3 arguments we have. Argument 1 is on this, argument 2 is on this, argument 3 is on this. Last is, and I still enjoy spending a lot of time for making arguments. Again, we'll talk about how to do that a bit more in the coming videos. So this is for opening. For closing, I have changed a bit. I don't think you will have to set up as much, and I would instead spend that time on strategizing. There's a big difference in terms of understanding the scope of the debate with respect to the nuance, which is a lot of the time your opening team will focus on having a speech, having something prepared, and thus won't have the most amount of time to identify small differences that could actually be very meaningful. So you want to ask yourself at closing, are there unique twists, ways that we can enter the debate from in order to ensure that we have an extension? Second is you want to strategize. So now you're coming up with your extension and how you're going to prove it. So you ask yourself, what are common arguments you can make in this debate? Let's not make them. If the debate is wide, what are all the possible angles of attack? Is there an aspect of the debate that even after 14 minutes of speech, you will still have for sure on your side? And if it's narrow, you want to ask what are the possible characterizations that you can make? So if there aren't many arguments, what are the ways you can deepen and further some of the arguments that are being made? Lastly is you want to generate cases. And I think there are a couple ways in which you could possibly extend. We'll get into this in the future, but one is vertically or just proving something better. And here's where you want to focus on why is this true? Because if the opening team will prove that argument, you have to explain why your analysis is good, if not, no, actually, why your analysis is better or necessary than your opening team if they're going to prove the same argument. But second is if you're going to prove a different argument, you now have to compare that argument and weigh that argument against your opening team. So that should be all. I hope this is helpful. And I think there is a guide available online if people want to see from the Monash Association of Debaters. It's a bit old, but I do think it helps kind of guide like starting out prep time especially. So thank you.